Good evening. I'd like to welcome you. I'm Jennifer Wenzel, professor of English and Comparative Literature and Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. I'm also an affiliate of the Columbia Climate School. And with Brian Larkin, I'm the faculty co-director of SOF Hayman. I'm a scholar of post-colonial literature and theory and environmental and energy humanities, with a particular focus on Anglophone African literature and culture. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening of conversation with Ruth Sacks, who is a visual artist and academic, whose creative practice is based in sculptural installation, artist books, and writing. Her research interests are Southern cities in the Anthropocene, decolonizing design, and post-independence aesthetics in Africa. Sacks' most recent artist book, The Remaindering, launched in 2022. I've just seen this beautiful book. And her, maybe upside down. And her first academic monograph, Congo Style, from Belgian Art Nouveau to African Independence, has just been released. She has exhibited widely as an artist, including at the Venice Biennale, Performa 09, and ZKM. In 2023, her work was exhibited at the CIVA Museum in Brussels, at the UJ and the UJ Art Gallery in Johannesburg. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg in the Visual Art Department, was one of the directors of the large-scale group project Responsibility at the Joubert Park Greenhouse Project in Johannesburg, about which I really would like to know a lot more. I hope she'll have something to say about that tonight. Also joining us tonight is Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi, an architectural historian at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an author of Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab refugee camps and humanitarian settlements, just out from Duke, or about to be out.
It's
just out.
The book is in my bag.
Out. It's 2024, so it's from Duke. It's a book on the spatial politics, visual rhetoric, ecologies, and long colonial traditions of the UNHCR administered camps at Dadaab, Kenya. She is the co-editor of the collection's Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration and Spatial Violence. Her current book project, Ecologies of the Past, The Inhabitations and Designs of Anil and Minette de Silva, analyzes the politics of heritage environments through the work of Sri Lankan architect Minette de Silva and art historian Anil de Silva Ligier. I first met Ruth Sacks in 2014 as I was leaving the University of Michigan to take this job at Columbia. Michigan had just launched a Mellon-funded collaboration with the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where Ruth was a doctoral student. I was drawn to her for many reasons, not least among them her interest in the Congo. I got interested in the Congo just before 9/11, when I was working on Onitsha market pamphlets from Nigeria, a popular literature that flourished in the years before the Biafran War. I was particularly interested in several of these Nigerian pamphlets that were plays about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. This led to a broader interest in Lumumba's tumultuous political life and powerful afterlife. I wrote a pair of articles about imagining Lumumba and the Congo, which were in effect preparatory studies for my first book. As with Lumumba and the Onitsha pamphleteers, I was interested in that book and how later writers, artists, and politicians remembered a 19th century prophet-led movement in Southern Africa and its unrealized promise of liberation. This interest in the intertwined relationship between memory and futurity, failure and possibility, also draws me to Ruth Sacks' work in her just published book, Congo Style, about which I want to say one more thing before asking her the question and to introduce herself to us. So for me, the visual archive of the Congo was dominated by two kinds of images. First, black and white photographs, whether from the infamous early 20th century expose of King Leopold's atrocities in the Congo Free State, or the journalistic documentation of Lumumba's rise and fall. So that's one kind of set of images. And second, the documentary and speculative series of paintings on the history of Zaire by Chibumba Kanda Matulu, a popular painter in Mobutu's Zaire, And some of Shibumba's paintings are inspired by these photographs, so there's an interesting relay between them. And it seems to me that Ruth is interested in not dissimilar questions, but her work opened up for me a visual imaginary that was at once completely new and disturbingly familiar. It traces the powerful connections between Art Nouveau, which we might want to think about as a strictly European aesthetic movement, and the consolidation of the Congo Free State and its extractive practices. So Ruth makes intriguing connections between the sinuous organic lines of Belgian Art Nouveau architecture and design and the landscapes and extractive economies of the Congo Free State. Connections that traverse metropole and colony, aesthetics, economics, colony and post-colony, past and present. I was in Brussels in 2021, and when I was there, I found myself just looking at the city through her eyes. I felt like I kind of learned to see what I was seeing through her work. So Ruth, as you kind of introduce yourself and your work, I'd love to hear you talk, among other things, about how you got interested in Congo and Congo style, and your desire to think about ideas and images of the Congo in a different way in the context of colonialism. So welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. Thank you to those who just joined. It's a very busy time, and so thank you to all and those online for making time. Anu and I have just met, and I look forward to thoroughly engaging with your research, Anu. Jennifer has explained how we met, but also what she hasn't explained is how she has always been a model of academic generosity with her work and with ideas, and was in fact the examiner for my PhD, one of them, which I think is worth mentioning. And that was the PhD that became the book Congo Style. Before I talk to the visual archive of the Congo and an imaginary of images, I think I need to add a little more to my biography than I have already circulated. I feel I need to say I'm a Jew and the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, as all the work we're about to discuss deals with the aftermath and creations around extreme violence. I feel it's important to decry the genocide taking place in Palestine in our midst. The death toll is currently 16,000 people. I feel it would be hypocritical to discuss colonial violence in Congo. My anti-colonial moves of discussing self-representation after independence without acknowledging current events. So I invite all of us here today to take a minute's silence for the deep loss of life felt in both Palestine and Israel. Would someone mind taking time? Thanks so much. Okay, so I can answer the question, well, I can give a version of an answer via some of the images themselves of the book. I feel that my own images for Congo Style were very much important as a way of trying to also not indulge in kind of enjoyments or of ruins and the ruination of the colonial, and also that of the of Mobutu's buildings. So in terms of the visual archive of the Congo, there are the black and white journalistic images of Lumumba, the wealth of paintings regarding Lumumba, were not where I sat with looking at visual culture, largely because I was interested in whole structures and sites themselves. So my principle with starting out in the book was to look at what I could find of colonial Art Nouveau, oppressive Art Nouveau, from how it was echoed, what remained of it in the Congo. So I went to literal Art Nouveau buildings that were remaining, rusting, reused, repurposed, patched up in Kinshasa itself and just outside Kinshasa, following the railway line. So that was the colonial railway line that went the Matadi-Leopold line, Leopoldville line, that allowed the mass extraction of Congolese raw materials out of the colony. And that was a logical place to start in imaging. And I was also very interested in Mobutu's structures, what was built as a form of African agency, what was built as a proclamation of power. And I don't deal greatly with the Lumumba archives and how Lumumba was imaged, because he never had the opportunity to build anything. Building started with Mobutu. There was actually enough, comparative stability in the Congo in the late 60s and early 70s to build, to invest in the arts. Mobutu was a great investor in the arts. What I became utterly fascinated by was that, Mobutu, in a kind of echo of Art Nouveau, favored a style of design, favored architecture that was modernist, super modern, that suggested a whole way of life that went with it. And like Art Nouveau, that was unattainable. Do I need to say what Art Nouveau is?
Give us your
Okay.
definition.
Okay.
That would be great. Yeah.
So Art Nouveau is early modernist style from the late 19th, early 20th century. That's meant to be birthed in Belgium. It's very curly lines. I didn't take many pictures of it, but it was also known as the Congo Style, or Style Congo. And it was first birthed in the Venice Museum as part of a World's Fair, those typical highly colonial European fairs in which there was to human zoos. There was the latest technological advancement and the taming of native people, which has gotten a lot of attention. I became very concerned and consumed with, but what about the forms that went with it? What about this style that was also called Style of the Congo? And that was my starting point, sort of unpacking what was very modern and meant to be forward thinking at the time, and what's at the heart of it. And that includes very much material. It includes mass extraction of natural materials. It's a potential start of Anthropocene thinking in terms of lots of ivory, lots of woods, and species becoming extinct because they were so vastly drawn from Central Africa, from the Congo itself. And when we start thinking about the Congo as resource, I think its artworks, the African artworks at the time, also became a kind of resource that became kind of churned through the colonial machine. So when I went to Kinshasa looking for the remains of Congo Style, I was very concerned with looking at what was remained of industrial industry. So my envisioning of the Congo and my capturing of the Congo is very much concerned with what remains today and how structures and sites that were constructed by Mobutu continue to function, because these are lively spaces. They're filled with people. They certainly do not live up to the initial intentions of their architecture, which the buildings, it's kind of almost sci-fi, futuristic visions of the future. Mobutu had his own space race at some point. Very different kinds of buildings that are still very much used, although not for what they were meant for. You have glass towers that they can't be cleaned. The elevators don't go to the top floor, so the electricity is intermittent, and yet, you know, I found cavernous ballrooms where a creche was being held. So there's this different kind of use. And similarly, there is also quite an interesting phenomenon of the grounds that used to be really well kept and luscious, that are now used for farming, for subsistence. And that growing of maize specifically has actually led to a whole trajectory of thought. So my images, there's a lot of plants in my images, because I feel there's a lot of work that plants do. There's less images of artwork than sort of would be expected of a book by someone like me, who comes from visual art. However, all of these buildings were intended to have artworks, and all of these buildings originally had artworks not by the popular painters, who fulfilled a lot of needs of European scholars and European art critics. And this was a point that the Mobutu regime picked up on. The art they supported was an art that looked modern. And there's a whole group called the avant-gardists, who I do take some time to discuss. Those artworks themselves, for me, are quite thin. I can't actually find much to say about them, except the role they played in conjunction with these hyper-modernist spaces and these different visions of the future. So I've included, I don't know, my own images that I feel quite iconic for me, about kind of dense and jolts and jarring areas that these sites that were Mobutu's occupy in the city space. So there are two areas here. There are the state sites that are the remains of Art Nouveau, that are the colonial buildings from about 1911 to 1915. They came with the railway, literally came on the railway. And they came with violent industrialization and extraction. And the metal itself of the railway is alive. The surfaces are alive. But the artworks, there's this is where I became much more interested in the plants than in the trains themselves. Those that know Art Nouveau, there's a reversal of kind of Art Nouveau grip, holding a plant, to the plants holding the industrial object. I'm going. So I hope, Jennifer, that answers your question. How the images take the book into I think a different kind of realm, and one that looks to the greenery, one that looks to the living world, as much as it tries to document what's going on in the text, which is a post-colonial critique.
May I jump in?
Please.
It should be on. Can you, is it not?
Yeah, it's
Okay. Hopefully the sound is good. So Ruth, I have so many things to say and to ask, but I mostly want to open by thanking you for the various kinds of labor that we can see in this book. I think we are, I'm an architectural historian, for those of you who may not know, but I have found that one of the challenges that I face as someone who works in architectural history and teaches it is that what we want to be teaching is the way in which the built environment, which is what we all interact with day in and day out, is actually a part of larger stories and isn't segregated disciplinarily. And so your work in this book gives us some, I think, very distinct avenues to do that. I wanted to open up a question to you that is one of the first kind of theoretical arguments you get to in your book about the Gesamtkunstwerk. And you talk about, you use Juliette Koss's work and others' work to really think about the total artwork. So one of the things also about Art Nouveau, beyond its motifs that lend itself to thinking about the environment, there have been these other layers of narration by Deborah Silverman and others in which plant life is also likened to. So first of all, these Art Nouveau shapes are made possible because of the technology of wrought iron and its ability to be curved into different shapes. And wrought iron, of course, is made possible from all this raw material extraction. But she tells us stories of how motifs copy the shape of whips used to dominate people. And there are many things she talks about that are, I think we don't need to get into all of the disturbing visual history right now, but one of the things that I found in your work was this real way of speaking in a way that was very open and healing about sites that could otherwise have been, for lack of a better way to say it, re-extracted from in order to tell a visual story. And to me, that's the liberatory hope I have for architectural history. Let me just put it all out there. And I think that there are so many reasons why architectural history, and you take on art history in particular as your boogeyman in the book, but there are reasons why these fields formed the way they did, and there are reasons why we're in a moment now where we can re-narrate. So I wanted to ask you to talk about the total artwork, to talk about it in terms of the places you looked at and also your own approach. There are probably many things you can say. I just wanted to open that for you.
Thank you for those generous questions. I have to say, architectural historians usually are not particularly enamored of my style of engagement, so it's good to hear. It's good to hear that this is seen as something different, perhaps innovative. I make no claims to architectural history. However, I really take the built environment as something that's situated. Like we need to take a situated view of each site, and in terms of the set of relations in which it's in place. And I think my understanding of that as a visual artist is always going to be quite different to an architect. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about the life of a building, it's not a metaphor. It's the life of the building, and I think that can be quite frustrating. But stick with it, please. The book is for free. You can get it online. Keep going. I promise there's a lot in there. In terms of the Gesamtkunstwerk, that is a leading motif across the book as something that's has led historically from the late 19th century to oppressive systems of government, to racialized kind of white superiority, even to express a purity of culture in, for example, the famous example of Wagner. And I was interested in how the Gesamtkunstwerk intends to work, never quite does work. By its very definition, it's something that always sort of is constantly trying to make and remake itself, and never quite fulfilling its goal.
Yeah, I was very taken with this problem that you set up of the complete work. So I was hoping you could talk more.
It becomes more complete I think it becomes complete according to what it is like in the present moment, in the moment of experience, which even Wagner would have absolutely wholeheartedly agreed with, I think. The style of Art Nouveau, the European style, and particularly the Belgian style, was first called total artwork, a Gesamtkunstwerk. I think in the 80s, 1980s, by historians in retrospect. And that's because there's architecture, furniture, everything is sort of micromanaged, over-designed, to right down to the teaspoons and the book covers of what you can bring into the house.
But also art with craft.
Yeah, and a making. And putting on the elevation of a kind of romanticized idea of European pasts, and Some argue other cultures, certainly huge amount of Orientalism, and in Edward Said's sense of the word, but a huge amount of Asian influence broadly. And there's a lot of Japan in there, but in Congo Style, in Style Congo itself, in this Art Nouveau in Belgium, there's very little of actual Africa. You have to look very hard for motifs that refer to Africa. But as Deborah Silverman points out, that there is a lot on the nature. There's two things I'd like to say. Silverman is remarkable for following the Art Nouveau as a colonial style and setting that precedent and pushing that line. And I mean, we chat. We have very different concerns. I must say that Deborah's work does push a very mimetic line, like and I love this about her writing. She can't look at Art Nouveau without seeing the woods or the rubber plants. And I think abstraction is more complicated than that. And I think that's a political move on her part. I personally don't stay with Art Nouveau because I want to look at Congolese self-representation. And I want to look at, and I want to keep looking at the post-independence moment and not at contemporary Congolese voices, because I think it's much more difficult to deal with the complexity of, okay, Mobutu is a polarizing figure that created sites and cultural events that are still adored in Kinshasa today. There's a very different perspective of what Mobutu did for the arts. Is still hugely respected in that moment of Africanization that happened in the post-independence moment. And that is much more difficult to try and come to terms with. And it's too easy to say, oh, he was as bad as Leopold II. He was as bad as the colonial government that went before. The colonial government that went before built Mobutu. They put him in power quite deliberately. And I think that is less easy. And I think there's more Art Nouveau there in terms of the Gesamtkunstwerk and the larger Gesamtkunstwerk that Mobutu tried to build of Kinshasa, looking at the craft. And the craft had to be African, but the buildings had to be modern and look like Europe, or like China, or like Brazil, depending on his mood. Mobutu would switch between various powers according to what suited him. And the only thing that was stable in that were, in fact, the particular kind of artists and art that he supported, and the craft within that was very much a hand-woven basket, an African aesthetic, kind of self-exoticizing with complete knowledge and irony within the European book. These were very visually savvy people. They knew what they were doing, and that I find quite fascinating. So in terms of that, Gesamtkunstwerk, that totality of a message, the post-independence Congolese modernism is fragmented. And I think that is, for me, the more interesting place to sit to try and understand a lot of what was happening politically, what is happening politically in the Congo. And instead of the contemporary artist, which is the go-to point usually when discussing certainly what Deborah does after discussing Art Nouveau, and very much the illustration of Art Nouveau to moving into my peers like Sami Balaji, who I don't write about, I work with. I'm in conversation with more as an artist. So
Can I ask one
that was
follow-up?
another
Right.
long question. Answer. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm just so interested in this problem, and I mean, you said it just now, but I think it appears in different waves in your book about, just this comparison with Silverman's approach, that approach that you call mimetic, or you might think of it as a form of overrepresentation, and this other practice that you talk about, like perhaps thinking about these buildings from an artist's perspective, or maybe from the perspective of someone who is a maker. This to me gets a little bit at how one thinks about a style from the sovereign perspective. What does it mean to be self-sovereign? What does it mean to be a maker? And to write your histories from that perspective, as opposed to trying to represent, based on something that comes from elsewhere. I wonder if, I wanted to actually ask you a little bit more, we'll maybe get to this, about your own, what does it mean to be an artist who has then become, you won't call yourself an architectural historian, but you have told some histories in this book. So however you want to think of what this book is, it is an intervention in a sense into an art history. What is that like methodologically also? What is that transition like? Because it seems to me that gives you great purchase on being able to speak from a perspective of self-determination, just simply methodologically through your own knowledge of materials, knowledge of forms.
Methodologically, I think that my own practice of making informs entirely how I approach my research topic. I approach it the same way I would in art. In terms of the preparation, the field work, and I actually I brought in some examples of an artist's book. Those who are in peace. That actually deals entirely with what a social scientist would call ephemera from the field. Because as an artist, that's the first thing I would go for normally. So that's art. I'm passing around the remaindering. It's also available online. In just, I mean, on my website, you can page through the pages too. For those of you inside the computer. And the book is an opportunity, and so the artwork is an opportunity to push ideas that I don't think would have been that welcome in the academic book. They sort of fell out of the book. I take photographs in this case, sometimes draw pictures. Usually that comes later, but I take photos and make quick sketches and take lots of notes in order to gather information, in order to write my academic text. So there's a focus there in the experiential that, yes, that comes from a lot of theory and broadly new materialism as a way of entering. But thinking with new materialism, thinking with a situated view, thinking with ideas by even Haraway, in terms of words we use, matter. And Barad says matter matters, which equally, these all just inform what I do as an artist anyway, and what people from visual art, that it's great to read, to engage with the theory, because that's kind of always what we've done. So, you know, to suddenly discover Merleau-Ponty is, it's just the most convenient thing in the world. To then combine Merleau-Ponty with Fanon, that's the fun, you know, that's where I think the real sparks start to fly, and I gain a lot of energy. And particularly Césaire, with thinking with the natural world, and issues of North and South. I really love this idea of a refusal of re-extraction, which really does help me a lot as a kind of tool, as a way of thinking of going forward. Thank you for that.
You know, I was hoping that you would, I was going to ask you to put this image up, and then I discovered it was there. Oh. I was going to ask for this image, but I discovered it had already been displayed, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, because this is your image. I'm not sure it's clear to the audience that this is it's your image, and it appears in the early frontispiece, but it's very across from the table of contents. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about it, because I believe that I recognize Mobutu's Tower of the Exchange as plants and maybe an elephant. And so I was one of the questions I was going to ask you was, you've kind of begun to speak to already, which is about a recent essay I read about of yours. I read about plants in Johannesburg, and so I was very interested in your kind of plant-centered reading there, and I think you've already started to do that for the Congo. So I would invite you just to kind of tell us a little bit more about this image, which is suggestive to me in all kinds of ways for things that you've been talking about. And I would also invite you then to shift into showing us some of your other artworks, that I think that you have images of, that I would love to hear you talk more about material and mattering, and how they're engaging with histories and futures, whether complete or incomplete.
This was meant to be the cover. And the current covers of it does look like a work of architectural history. But it was not to be. So next time when we reprint it, that this will indeed be the cover, I hope.
So we used it as the poster, and I assume you really appreciated that. And okay, great.
But I did make the this artwork as this is an example of my drawings, and I'll brush through a few more as we go. That is indeed at the top is the Tower of Exchange and Well Spotted Jennifer, and that is an elephant in the right-hand corner. It's Victor Horta's elephant. So Victor Horta was one of the is the main Art Nouveau Belgian artist. Victor Horta and Henry van der Velde, and he built a house for Edmund van Eertvelder, who was the kind of head of operations of the Congo. And he never went to the Congo. He sat in his house with King Leopold II would visit. It was marvelous, fantastical, crystal wood and marble palace. And the only sort of reference to the Congo is this elephant. And I'm always quite fascinated by creatures. The style is in an Art Nouveau style. It's trying to, the image is trying to raise questions about connections between Mobutu's iconic forms and Art Nouveau, but also questions of what are attitudes to nature, and what is really evident in Art Nouveau, which sort of aim to take recourse in nature, and in fact, what comes through the most is its artificiality, in my opinion. I was kind of trying to move into that with that image, and also I wanted to make something quite enticing and pretty that would function in the way Art Nouveau to me functions, which is that it tried to seduce, it tried to encircle. It's awesome. I've been fascinated by Art Nouveau for quite some time, and how it views the natural world, how it tries to sort of stamp it and frame it and classify it, while sort of harnessing its energy. There's so when I first got interested in this style, I was living in Belgium, and I sort of looked at the dates on these things on Art Nouveau, and this the main thing tourists need to see is this Art Nouveau style and these strange curling forms. It was the same time as it was exactly the same time as the major colonial inroads into the Congo Free State, and then it doesn't take much to put two and two together, and then just a little bit of research revealed that indeed Art Nouveau was the new modern style for the colonialist, and every single major colonial funder had an Art Nouveau dwelling. So that sort of got me started, and that was a long time before I embarked on a PhD. Very quickly, in Western Europe, the work of Jules Verne is very, very popular, and it's read to children, and it's basically the story of a man who tries to colonize the ocean it tries to colonize the sea. And there's it's an adventure story. Everyone goes around in a submarine. I rewrote it, which is one of the modes I occupy when I make book art work, to highlight colonial issues. I made the submarine an Art Nouveau submarine. There's a collection of African art under the sea. This is all in the text. The illustrations to the book look like this. They're words that were actually censored, taken out of the English translations of the book. So that they function as a mirror image. Each set of illustrations, again, it's available online. You can just page through to get an idea. But the censored images here were long lists of types of fish and currents and winds that were considered too boring. And they removed all things about British colonialism. But nevertheless, and all sorts of strange political affiliations. But that really got me interested. I was interested in early bookmaking from that time, where the object of the book was what was worth the money, not the copyright on the story. It was the actual pages. And no one can read a novella sitting in a gallery. So so I also made sure the book was sculptural. So that's when you put a lot of the books together, they make a typically Art Nouveau pattern. For example, I also make quite stark forms. As you can see, those who have the remaindering in front of them, I've spoken to it a little bit. This is based on sort of the remains of world fairs, the bits about this book that didn't quite fit. I sort of dismember parts of architectural plans and images of sites that don't really know what they are, that are ambiguous, that like there's a set of, for example, in the Congo, there's a set of bridge stairs that without the bridge part that I talk about in some detail, and they're completely a meeting point, and there is a site where shopping takes place. So I kind of, the way I draw them is I take apart, I outline parts of them, and then I put them back together to tell a story. And you can find that in the book. And there are also, there's quite a lot of time spent on a pavilion, a glass pavilion that was meant for Paris 1900s World's Fair. That's one of the forms I use. That was Art Nouveau. That was designed by Victor Horta. Never made it to the actual World's Fair because well, at that point the first colonial regime, King Leopold II's Congo Free State had kind of been exposed. The French were also following the exact same red rubber practices, make no mistake, but everyone is very quick to point to Leopold as the bad guy, and very luxurious sort of palaces made of glass that were not to be sort of propagated. So only the plans of this remain. What fascinated me is the plan was to send this palace to the Congo as offices for the colonial administration. So it's like a hothouse, which to me just it just in every way.
I've never heard that story.
Illustrates, yeah, illustrates the utter lack of ability of the actual Art Nouveau architects and designers to even conceptualize what a body does in the middle of Central Africa, let alone the labor and the extreme violence of forced labor that goes into the construction of any colonial building. So I did a series of works. There's sculptures based on these fragments that I explore in the remaindering, and I worked with an iron forge, which was absolutely fascinating. But I made these little sculptures, you get a sense of how big they are, that can move around and take on lots of formations. They're rusted, very rusted. And I sent them back to Belgium from Africa, from Johannesburg. And they're now in archives that also, their permanent home is now in archives where Victor Horta's plans actually are as well. And what I find interesting about iron, once you rust it, is it's live. And it keeps rusting, does not stop. And there's something corrosive and interesting about that, and a kind of refusal of archive that I'm pushing for. I did the same with the plans for this palace. And that's in a larger book with a larger story.
I'm so intrigued by your work. I was so intrigued by your work in Iron, which for me echoes your discussion of the Iron Hotel, the hotels that were built in Congo. But I think maybe the thing to do now is see if there are any questions or comments from the audience.
We have access to the online audience.
Is there? Yeah.
Oh dear.
No, I see. Okay. Oh, sorry.
And again? Far away. That far away?
Farther still.
Hi, thank you so much. It's not a question, and but I was sort of intrigued by the basically about the exhibition, right? The hothousing. And it, it's not a question at all, except that I worked on a book about the Crystal Palace. So, and I'm just sort of thinking about, running through my mind about, what the purpose of that and what it showed and what it showed from colonies and things. So I guess the question is more historical than anything else, which is that what was shown in the Paris exhibition, which was, when was it? It was the Crystal Palace was 1851. The Paris one is 1870 something. Is that right?
Paris. So there were a couple of Paris ones.
Right. But this one.
The one that Victor Horta intended to have his pavilion at was 1900.
1900.
The Art Nouveau
Okay.
exhibition, World's Fair with colonial exhibitions.
Right. So that, I guess that maybe I just having you telling me a bit more about the relationship between the colonialist project and the 1900 exhibition, because I mean, so it was a collection, and many of us, I don't know how many people, 12 of us, I guess, wrote essays for it, and so mine was about how, in fact, the sort of a taxonomy. It was about the books, right? About the guides that were written to the Crystal Palace, which were, it seemed to me in some ways was a revelation to the people who kind of put it together about we have colonies, right? They hadn't kind of really understood. I mean, so 1857, the Indian uprising happens afterwards. There's a big kind of colonial push. So I guess I guess is there any connection between the representation, the display of things colonial as a way to kind of, I don't know, like further the project? I mean, it does seem to me that, at least in the case of England, that, they suddenly understood that they had these massive expansions. Half the palace is taken up with India and its colonies, but as part of what they do, right? So half the palace, the Hyde Park thing, is all them, and then half of it is whatever. So I'm just, I'm not, as I say, it's not a question, but it's also because it's all it's the greenhouse stuff. I mean,
Mm.
that's the Crystal Palace was also the greenhouse, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was the model. That's the first time the technology of the iron structures with a glass with glass walls first came into being, and then kind of as that moved out of the UK and into Western Europe, it took on these more bizarre and outrageous forms and curls that the British never sort of adhered to. So that's visually. I mean, don't Marx and Engels also talk about Crystal Palace as as amongst the first to say this is colonial, this is oppressive use of industry.
Yeah.
It-
I don't know. I mean, I
Okay.
don't remember that being the case. And there were certainly lots of Marxists who, contributed to the
Right.
volume, and I don't think they did pointed at that either. But it was also the fact that it grew out of, the architect for the, Crystal Palace, it's the person who had done Kew Gardens, right? He was the
Yeah.
gardener at Kew Gardens, right? So this idea somehow that it's somehow of the earth too, right? But I mean, it's very, and that everybody copies it.
I can't remember his name. I've been extremely fascinated by pattern books. And one of the pattern books that one of the designers of Crystal Palace, his father had been in India as one of the officials, and he proceeded to then make a pattern book of Indian styles and primitive styles. Africa and South Sea islands are all sort of crammed into one, and Persian styles. And the text that goes with these patterns is quite, to our minds, offensive. But there's this kind of additional use of the book as a way of kind of flattening and making available other styles as resource, which every Art Nouveau artist in Belgium read. They loved that book. Not the Grammar of Ornament. The name will come to me as soon as we finish speaking. It is the 1897 Congo Pavilion in Belgium, in Brussels. That was the start of the Tervuren Museum. It's an infamous museum. That coined the term Congo Style. That was the first Art Nouveau extravaganza. And it was also meant to be escapist. It was meant to be transportative. It was meant to be this sort of really disjointed space to give you the impression of being somewhere exotic, somewhere very different. And I saw an exhibition in Belgium fairly recently where African art was being shown in Art Nouveau cases that were from that 1897 Congo Pavilion, which, so those are cases by Saruria Bogi, and on the wall is contemporary art. But that was kind of what remains of the Gesamtkunstwerk is that was that colonial pavilion in 1890s. I find fascinating.
Do we have time to, I just want to dig in a little more with this. I'd had this question, and I actually don't even know what my question is in a way, but I've been grappling with this concept of style, independent of your book, but then coming across your book in the middle of this has, one of the questions I was suggesting that Jennifer and I kind of ask you to open up is, why do we need to think about a re-narration of the Congo through the lens of style now? I mean, I also had a question about why re-narrate art history through the Gesamtkunstwerk now. And you were generous enough to open up our session with a moment of silence. And I can't help but, you know, think about this question of now in thinking about your work, and very much in thinking about the problem of style. I've always learned style as a crystallization of nationalisms and ethno-nationalisms, colonial ethno-nationalisms, and also well, I was just thinking about the pattern books that you raised. These were colonial visions of ethnic styles, even if they were not, you know, made. They might have been made by people in India, but they were
Versions of,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, they're re-representations. And so this problem of style and the way the word style is so much associated with the Congo of all African modernisms and all African, you know, I'm including Art Nouveau in the modernist wave that I'm talking about. And, you know, just the whole problem of style as it then creeps through the 1900s to this moment of what gets coined as the international style, which many also called the Jewish style. Many racists also called the Jewish style. I think I've been really revisiting this problem, this word style, in these last couple of months, and also the problem for art history in boiling down movements or periods or just historicizations of art to stylistic movements. And I think you probably have a lot of insight into this, and I hope this isn't, I don't want to ask a painful question. I think it's painful for all of us who are working on anti-racist histories. And I think we don't also have to unpack it too much in our short time, but I felt like you would be a person who would have much to say about this. So if I put it on the table, and if you have something to offer, I would love to hear your take on this.
I think what I try and do in the book is make a move from the modernist obsession with category, with style, with huge adherence to nationalism, into the second section of the book, which is very much what was built in an Africanized in post-independence Congo. And while I name the first half of the book Style Congo, the Art Nouveau stuff, the second half of the book is called Congo Style. And I'm looking at African self-representation. I'm attempting to find some, not just trying to find agency on the part of new governments, but attempting to find what is still sort of revered and looked up to in Kinshasa today. And while the Art Nouveau style, the Art Nouveau movement, the word style was used, yeah, as an insult, as the Jewish style certainly must be with international style. But there were a lot of derogatory names for Art Nouveau. And that was the noodle style, and the Congo style was part of these rude names: the noodle style, the spaghetti style, the octopus style, the Jules Verne style, amongst many others. And what I try to get to in the second part of the book is to see what can be recuperated from from the objects, and I mean, I take whole sites as objects, the objects of a highly oppressive regime. And I move in the second half of the book into looking at the Congo is also a place that's very stylish. There are the Sapirs who dress very flashily, but also with a deep sense of irony. There's a sense of humor to the reuse of Mobutu's buildings that has a certain style, like moving into style as something perhaps more keyed into lived experience, as much as as an intruder in the space of Kinshasa can access. I was trying to move into perhaps a different use of style. Very much what can we gain today? Yeah.
I'm not sure that you'll see how this follows from what you're saying, but I was struck in your photographs, and I think the one of Tiburon works well there, that it feels to me almost like what you're wanting to get at with this idea of a kind of living style and the recycling and ironic re-inhabitation of these buildings from Mobutu is something that me lies between two kinds of images here, which are both in the photograph from Belgium, and I think there's also one, if I'm not mistaken, in Congo, of the massive crane, right? Which to me is the current image of the new, right? And you have just a very few photographs of ruins, but it feels like your real interest is kind of like between the ruin and the massive new, right? It's kind of the more kind of granular, on the ground inhabited style. And it also feels like it's wanting to engage with and acknowledge, but also kind of break out of this kind of astonishing containment of African art, whether current or previous, in these Art Nouveau vitrines, right? So I think the vitrine is important in your work, but what sounds like what you're wanting to put your finger on in the second part of the book, and perhaps even in your own practice, is a space that's not the ruin, it's not the crane, it's not the vitrine, right? But something else, and maybe that's where style can be something else.
I like it. I mean, I too had that affective kind of reaction to these images, that we're inhabiting these images with you. I mean, we're inhabiting an actual ground, and it is this funny, I mean, I think for all of us who spend a lot of time in different parts of Africa, we're very familiar with this language of these hyper modern and hyper new, and the constantly under construction, and then these things that are constantly under decay in different ways. So the photographs really make it really quite inhabitable in a way that I thought was so helpful in exactly what you're talking about.
I think that is also one of the uses of the photographs, is they can do a lot of work towards emphasizing the fact that the researcher is always subject, the photographer is always subject, which I also try and do in the style of writing. Yeah, that image of the crane is an important one for me, and there's something about this. I mean, there's so much to say about the need for a superficial show of development, a need to build things that indeed are very often not going to even be used. And the sort of false promise of progress is seldom fulfilled. So thank you for that. The book categorically sort of tries to move between categories, and it tries to sit in a space of ambiguity and in-betweenness. I think I explored the most fully in the remaindering.
It is in the language of, maybe we can, I mean, you can see it in this photograph, but I think you can see it very well in the Kinshasa photograph. Who's got can we flip forward a few?
Which Kinshasa?
Sorry,
Oh.
the other way. You can see it in many of the
Okay.
photographs, but it's the, nope, this one. It's the slightly tilted lines. That, yeah, I mean, I think just as someone who's been trained in architectural photography, the very first lesson that you learn is the way of holding the camera so it's absolutely parallel so that all the lines are straight. And you've clearly privileged your own body to that camera plane in all the photographs, but I think it's just most noticeable here. And I think it speaks exactly to this this thing of we stand on ground. There's a ground is not level. There's many different ways to read this kind of a photograph. But I think you've done that through at least these images that we're seeing here. And as you say, there's plants creep their way into the corners of literally every photograph that you have in ways that take up an awkward amount of space. Like there's no framing in that sense. Of course, one is always framing, but you're not framing the way that we're trained to expect.
I think that's a really generous reading. I have made sort of light boxes of this image for an exhibition installation, and I did correct the straight line, but it made more sense there in terms of the role of the photograph, the responsibility of the light box of the photograph in that scene, within the other objects and images of the exhibition. It needed to show a kind of hopeful Congo that was organized.
All right, well, I'd like to thank Ruth Sacks and Siddiqi for their generous engagement with these questions, and all of you for coming. It's been a wonderful evening, so thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.